Welcome to Dev Better, the show where we talk about the organizational and software engineering challenges we have encountered as a software consulting firm. Today, we're talking about Azure Kubernetes Service. Kubernetes is a portable, extensible, open source platform for managing containerized workloads and services that facilitates both declarative configuration and automation. Some folks love it. Other folks think it's like digging a hole with a chainsaw or pounding a nail with a sledgehammer. Whatever your slant, it's an innovative take on a managed cluster technology and is in line with most products that Google has adopted, complex yet satisfying. Azure Kubernetes Service is a managed service that offers a fast and clean way to start developing and deploying cloud-native apps in Azure. As a hosted Kubernetes service, Azure handles the critical tasks like health monitoring and maintenance. When you create an AKS cluster, a control plane is automatically created and configured and is provided at no cost as a managed Azure service, and it's abstracted away from the user. Today, we have Tom Gamble, Principal Software Engineering Manager for Azure Kubernetes Service at Microsoft. And we're going to dig into the technical details, use cases, and sizzle for AKS. I also have Alan Brooks, Director of Software Engineering at 7Factor and our resident Azure expert. We're going to chat about the architectural ideologies behind AKS, when you'd want to use it, why you'd want to use it, and what it brings to the table that other Kubernetes managed services don't. Then we'll chat about something Microsoft has always been best in class with, the developer experience. Let's dive in. Hey, Tom, how are you?
I'm doing great, Jeremy. Thanks for having me here.
It's been a while since you and I have hung out, and I'm very excited to have you on because I know absolutely nothing about Kubernetes. And the whole point of this is just a chat about what you guys are doing at Microsoft. So you have some really cool developer experience things that I know we're going to chat about. But also, before we talk about that, I think it's useful for the audience just to generally talk about what the Azure Kubernetes service offers from a control plane perspective. So why don't you just tell us a little bit, give us the elevator pitch on Azure Kubernetes service.
Yeah, for sure. So I think one of the things that people talk about with Kubernetes is it can be very complex. It can be difficult to set up. It can be difficult to keep it up to date and to ensure it's secure. Mm-hmm. And that's really what the idea behind managed Kubernetes, and in my case, Azure Kubernetes Service is we really take all of the control plane, all of the setup, and try to make that, if not invisible, extremely abstracted from the end user, so that you can really focus on the things that matter to you, such as your application, and making sure that you have a cost-efficient solution to provide whatever functionalities you want to provide. So in general, control plane abstracted away from you. You really just see the worker nodes and that data plane layer, so you can deploy your apps, but you still have the full power of the Kubernetes API, which I think is both helpful and what people are looking for.
Are those machines managed at all do you have to do any patching or anything like that, or is that all handled in the Kubernetes service?
Sure. So for the kind of data plane, the worker nodes, mm-hmm. You have options. To some degree, you're kind of dragged along with Kubernetes upgrades, and those will get updated. But you can also subscribe to different channels, so you have kind of the node image update that will happen when a security patch comes out, as well as when features and things like that come out. So for the most part, yes, we manage the updates for you.
Got it. And host metrics and things like that through, I'm sorry, I'm going to sound stupid. What is Azure's Container Insights, yeah. So you guys handle all the host metrics and Azure monitoring and all that stuff. Yeah, just for those of you watching, I am not the Azure guy, right? The Azure guy is Alan, who will hopefully ask smarter questions than me. I'm the Amazon guy. So I don't know why I'm doing this, but hey, it should be fun.
But yeah. So with the kind of the Azure Monitor Container Insights, you can see utilization, both CPU and memory. You can see resource health, but you also have fairly detailed log capabilities as well with all the kind of Kubernetes logs. Mm-hmm. One of the things I really like is it has or canned queries for you. So you don't have to remember exactly how to query, say, pod restarts or pod health. It actually just has a button you can click. It gives you the query. And then if you want to edit it, change the time, filter some things out, you can do that in the interface there.
Cool. And so, great overview. So given that, I mean, the thing I know most about Kubernetes is like the meme where you have the flatbed truck with the pallet and the little like tiny cube on it. Sure. And it said, I just deployed my blog to Kubernetes. Like that's what I know about it. So talk to me about architectural patterns. Obviously it's a good platform, right? It's open source. It's written by Google. It's very, very complicated in many ways, but it's also very powerful. Talk to me about some of the architectural patterns on why you would use Kubernetes. Like what are some general general use cases for it.
Yeah. And I think that, for the single app blog, maybe it could be overkill. You can definitely slim down your Kubernetes cluster so it's close. And especially with us covering the bill for the control plane, it can be quite cheap. But I think the big thing with Kubernetes is really that it provides standardization from an API perspective, so you can handle scheduling, you can handle scaling, and you have kind of a well-defined interface for logs. And I think if you look at other solutions or kind of roll your own solutions, like you get into a weird place where either that all becomes very proprietary or it's all kind of a one-off depending on which application. So I think Kubernetes really solves for a lot of that. I think if you're looking at a fleet of applications or a number of applications, it gets really exciting because all of those have a standard. Here's how our scaling works, how the logging works, and we all get scheduled, and ideally kind of scheduled to a place where the VMs are used up fully or nearly fully, with lots of fun like auto scaling features. You've got horizontal auto scaling. You can go in and out with the node pools. I think all of that kind of the full ecosystem is where you really see the value.
Got it. So cool. So it sounds like vendor lock is a thing you tend to avoid when you use a Kubernetes cluster. How has Azure Kubernetes Service facilitated that?
Sure. And I think the biggest thing is we're providing you that straight access to the Kubernetes API, which should be the same regardless of platform. I think with any managed Kubernetes service, there are going to be elements where it's slightly different, how we interact with other resources in the environment. But because of the way the Kubernetes cloud provider works, a lot of that is abstracted away, and so it will be the same regardless of where you go. The things that you probably need to think about are just kind of the external pieces. So we use Azure Policy to kind of control some of the security and some of the settings.
Right.
Some of the networking pieces can be a little bit different from cloud to cloud, and you really just have to dive into what you need and what you want to do. But I think for the most part, Kubernetes across clusters, the application level is very, very similar, and you shouldn't have too many gotchas. It's where you get beyond just application level where you start to see the differences.
Got it. Makes sense. What about the infrastructure as code story for Azure Kubernetes Service? What does that look like? Because I'm very excited about infrastructure as code.
For sure. That will actually segue into one of the tools that I want to talk about later. But I think in general, you can set up your Azure infrastructure using either ARM, Bicep. Those are kind of our proprietary kind of ways of setting things up.
Right.
Similar to CloudFormation that you know and love. But also Terraform works perfectly well, and any of the other IC tools. Definitely a huge proponent of people making use of that for both the repeatability and just having a stable process. Beyond that, there's definitely options for controlling the internals of Kubernetes with IAC. One of the things that one of our partner teams within the AKS organization has created is called Azure Service Operator, and it lets you actually connect and manage other Azure resources using the Kubernetes API.
Oh, that's
so you
cool.
actually do kubectl apply to create a resource group or to create a Postgres SQL server. And all of that can be IAC in Kubernetes manifests. You can both import and export that way. So if you created it outside of the tool, you can export it into manifests and be able to use it again later. So lots of options. Certainly, you can use Terraform for a lot of the kind of Kubernetes interactions if you wanted to. So yeah.
Yeah, Amazon, if you're listening, I don't like CloudFormation. I like Terraform. But, it is, that's really cool, actually. One of the things that we had a client we were working inside Kubernetes with, and again, I'm not the Kubernetes expert, but we have people on our team that know it like way better than me. We had discussed that Kubernetes can actually spin out some of those things in one of the cloud providers, like it can build load balancers in AWS. So that's really cool that you have providers and a plug-in system where I can define in my manifest, I want a SQL server, and it will go off and sort of handle that for you. That's really, really cool. Didn't know it could do that. Okay, so I'm dying to know, Tom. Will Kubernetes solve all of my problems?
And the answer to that is yes. But there are a lot of things you have to do to enable Kubernetes to solve your problems. I was joking about the 15-year-old Java app that people just slam into a container and put on Kubernetes and expect performance to be amazing. And it's not going to be, right? So you definitely want to make sure you're on a reasonably recent Java version that supports cgroups 2 and all those good things so that container memory management works. You also want to look at Java garbage collection because it's not trivial in terms of should you horizontally scale, should you vertically scale, just to make sure the JVM performs properly. All these things are well documented and are very doable. But it's not the case that it's just going to be a magic bullet where just everything just works in the absence of thinking about it.
So as far as like the metal that you run these things on, I call it the metal, but really it's a virtual machine in a virtual machine in a virtual machine. It's sort of this inception thing.
Sure.
But what kind of control do you have over that? Because obviously you mentioned the performance thing, which is near and dear to my heart. I love tuning containers. It's fun for me for some reason. Suppose I like pain. Sure. But what kind of control do you have over your instances?
For the most part on Azure, we try to keep you out of the business of having to worry too much about the instances. Mm-hmm. Certainly, you have the control over the type of CPU, the type of memory and disk. So you can look at kind of your IOPS needs, your CPU, your memory needs. Mm-hmm. We do have the GPU nodes you can make use of if that's something that your application needs. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think those are kind of the big things.
Right. So basically, you shouldn't have to, which is a great answer, by the way. I mean, a lot of clustering solutions try to answer this question in the same way. And I do, if possible, I don't want to have to think about what I'm running on. But as you mentioned, sometimes when I'm running Java and I need heap space, I need to know what I'm running on,
sure,
right? And again, I know Kubernetes is smart and it can use bin packing and all these really cool algorithms to sort of place containers in appropriate spaces to have the right resources. But I've been running ECS for a very long time on Amazon, and I know that it's not a silver bullet, right? You still do have to think about how you're placing your containers and what the underlying metal looks like. So very cool.
Sure. Yeah.
So let's pivot and let's talk about developer experience, which is what your entire team does, right?
Yeah.
This is probably the more interesting part of the show for most folks, and I'm excited about it. I'm going to be the idiot in the room because I have no idea what you guys have provided on that, and I'm very excited to have Alan take over and ask some smarter questions, and I'll be able to. And I'll chime in occasionally, hopefully with some entertainment value. So I'm going to hand it to Alan. Let's talk about DX on Azure Kubernetes Service.
Absolutely. Let's do it. So yeah, the first question I got, I'm a big fan of the Microsoft toolchain. I've been in the Microsoft stack for about 10 years now, so love what's going on here. So the first question I got is, I'm starting a new K8 project. What are the pros and cons of choosing VS Code to run it over Visual Studio?
Sure. So yeah, that's kind of an interesting one. I think Visual Studio, definitely if you're using the .NET Suite or anything related to that, that's usually the right answer. It's a kind of complete application IDE for that environment. Has lots of bells and whistles. It is a paid product. Visual Studio Code, on the other hand, I think it is a full IDE at this point. I think it has more of a text editor roots, however, and certainly huge community support. And I think that's really where the benefit of Visual Studio Code comes from. It's not just Microsoft adding cool things in there, but it's everyone in the community that's putting things into it. I think for me personally, I don't do a lot of C#, so I generally would jump onto Visual Studio Code. But I think you can't go wrong with either product. Both have some exciting features.
Yeah, I feel like VS Code was like Sublime Text with a bunch of added flavor, because I was a huge fan of Sublime Text early on. I still use it, actually, so I'm dating myself.
Same here. Okay, good deal. So it looks like you got a number of extensions your team has built for both Visual Studio and VS Code to kind of help facilitate development. You got Azure Kubernetes extension for VS Code, the AKS DevX extension. What are some of the lesser known features of these extensions that provide a lot of value that people may not know about?
Yeah, for sure. So one feature I'm really excited about, and you're the first ones I'm telling about this, just released.
Hooray!
Is actually the standard cluster creation from VS Code. So one of the things that at times could be a blocker for people is you're writing your application, you're like, oh, I need a cluster. Certainly you can spin up a kind cluster or do something else locally, but in a lot of cases it's nice just to have it in the cloud so everything's the same, across your life cycles. And historically we kind of pointed to the portal, or you could use the CLI. But what we've added recently and really looking for feedback on is one click, just create standard cluster, and it spins up an AKS cluster for you. It's a very small kind of dev-focused cluster, but you don't have to do anything else, and there's your cluster. And you can immediately kind of get to work with it.
Cool.
So we'll probably have future offerings with different flavors of that, but we just wanted to get that out there and see kind of what people thought about it.
All right, so tell me about Azure Draft and kind of what the target use case is for it, and how I can get my hands dirty for it and what it's going to do for me.
Yeah, for sure. So the idea behind Draft is really taking a lot of the boilerplate kind of off the plate of the developer and making it a lot easier. So you've got your application, your binary, you're ready to go. Draft does a few things. The first, and this is kind of what it historically did, was it'll generate the Docker file for you. So it kind of looks at what's in your repo, or looks at what's locally on your disk, and says, oh, this is a Python application. And it'll create a Docker file that's kind of our best guess at what are the right choices for you. Certainly, we want people to review it and take a look at it.
That's cool.
But that's kind of the start.
Sweet.
But the kind of more recent enhancements are kind of twofold. One, going back to what Jeremy was saying regarding IAC, we actually create GitHub workflows for you now. So you link it up to your GitHub repo, and we'll actually create a pull request for you that has all the things you need to deploy your application onto a Kubernetes cluster, which is usually pretty helpful in hopefully pushing people in the right direction for deployment processes. And the final piece, which I'm really excited about, but doesn't sound as exciting, is making use of federated IDs. So historically, when you wanted to deploy from GitHub onto Kubernetes, there had to be a secret somewhere. So you had a client secret, which is not ideal. Like, you don't really want to be passing around secrets. It gets stored somewhere. Maybe you have to reset it. So federated IDs let you actually provide just your tenant ID, so kind of your Microsoft customer information, and then a client ID. So just here's the application I'm using, but there's no secret involved. So Draft actually has a way of tying that OIDC information up, so that from your GitHub repo you can deploy to your Kubernetes cluster, and it's much more secure, and you don't have to deal with a secret floating around.
Having been the recipient of a Microsoft acquisition in my career, I was very scared when you bought GitHub, but I think it's awesome. That's really cool, and it gives you a chance to integrate. You have Azure DevOps, which is obviously very rich platform for doing CI/CD. We've used GitHub Actions for a lot of stuff, and we really like them. There's a sort of a function-esque kind of play to GitHub Actions,
Exactly.
and I think the more you guys can bring to the table with respect to integration that's built into my repo, the better that's going to be. So that's a really cool, feature. I like that.
Yep.
And for folks that aren't using VS Code or the CLI, we actually have a relatively similar feature from the portal. If you're in your AKS cluster view, there's an automated deployments blade you can click into, and that lets you do very similar things I just discussed from a Draft perspective. So you can get your repo set up that way if you prefer the UI versus code or CLI.
Yeah, I've noticed a lot of Microsoft guys like their UIs. I grew up using Linux, so I'm like Linux guy. I sit around and type on my console all the time and green screen stuff. So, but I used to have my buddies make fun of me when I was working at a few other companies where it's like, oh, you like the console, I like the UI stuff. But Microsoft does an amazing job of UIifying a lot of those developer pieces. So kudos to your UX team.
Yeah, we definitely try to meet people where they are. So if the portal's where you want to be, we try to provide the functionality that makes sense there.
Yeah.
All right, so I know you mentioned that Draft kind of scaffolds a GitHub action for you, but for the folks on the Azure pipelines side of the house, what does Draft have any ties there? Anything to help with?
It doesn't at the moment. That's definitely something we're considering, and the more feedback we get about that, the more likely we are to prioritize that in a future release. Still does generate the Docker files, so you can get started that way, but it doesn't do the full workflow.
Got it.
Nice. All right, good deal. All right, so just kind of asking a fun question here. What's the coolest application of AKS that you're able to talk to us about?
I don't know that I have one in particular. I think what I've enjoyed seeing is the spread of kind of usages. So you have companies like SAP that are historical, not known for really the Microsoft architecture historically, but are running on AKS and making great use of it and using all the modern kind of tooling that you can think of. But you also have plenty of game companies and sports video type things, as well as AI type things that are running on there. So I think it's just the breadth of kind of people that have found a way to make use of it, which is pretty exciting.
Yep.
That's interesting. I have a follow-on question on that then. So you mentioned games. I never really think of Kubernetes as a way to deploy hardcore, like local networked, needs to run on the metal type stuff. Have you all seen a shift towards containerized applications running on par with things that are executing on the metal? Again, thinking back to games, right? You really need those TCP IP connections to be fast, and you have to have, maybe server affinity. There's all kinds of interesting things there that I think, dig into that a little bit. Have you seen people shift towards that more?
I definitely am. I feel like I'm seeing more of that. I think there's still applications where it doesn't quite make sense or where it's more of a struggle, but I feel like we have seen a lot more of that. And I think a combination of just improvements in the overall network stack, we've got a lot of different options for how your internal network works, how connections work, the kind of leverage you can pull on the Kubernetes side for scaling, and all the benefits we talked about before with just Kubernetes standardizing scheduling and placement of things, where it actually does make a lot of sense in many cases.
Last question here is what's your team excited about? What's on the horizon that you can share with us?
Sure. So, kind of the broader AKS team, one of the things that I'm super excited about that I just saw and is actually open sourced is called Kube Copilot. As you may imagine, it involves AI, and
Nice.
it actually lets you do a number of different things. But it deploys onto your cluster. It will analyze issues. It'll look for security problems. It'll generate manifests. It'll analyze manifests. You can ask it lots of questions. Relies on a lot of different open source things. You can point it to the open AI instance of your choosing. So it has a lot of functionality, and it's just really kind of the introductory step of how we can really harness the power of AI to make things easier on Kubernetes.
Yeah, that's exciting. I think
Nice.
ChatGPT is worming its way into everything, right?
Exactly.
Which you guys bought that company, so I would expect you to roll it out. So that's really cool, though.
So one of the tools that my team's been working on that's I find super exciting is Bridge to Kubernetes. So if you think about trying to speed up the developer lifecycle, having that really tight inner loop, the idea of having to compile your binary, deploy your binary, wait for it to spin up, and then test can be a little bit daunting. So Bridge to Kubernetes actually allows you to almost have like a hot reload experience regardless of the language you're using. So you can be in VS Code, you can be in Visual Studio, you can make your changes, it'll compile, and it'll automatically redirect traffic from the cluster to your local IDE, so you can instantly test your changes. So it's really exciting,
Nice.
fun to play with, and really lines up nicely with some of the other tools we're working on.
Mm-hmm.
One other piece of draft that I didn't mention earlier is application routing. So one of the things that can be quite complicated or potentially intimidating for folks coming onto Kubernetes is how do I actually get traffic to my application? And that's really the idea behind app routing is you provide a certificate, you provide your binary, and then we'll set up the ingress and load balancer and all those things for you, and it just kind of works. And draft actually will enable you to just say, hey, draft, set this application up for application routing, and that stuff will just work kind of out of the box. Continuing to work on it, making enhancements, but I think it's pretty exciting. And definitely remove some of the friction points that people see with getting started with Kubernetes.
Yeah, so as far as your local development goes, I feel like that is a thing that I've worked in my career long and hard to try and circumvent some of the challenges about running something in production versus running it on your machine, right? And running a Docker container on your local machine allows you to circumvent a lot of those issues because you're then planting that thing behind a cluster platform, right? But it sounds like this tool allows you to run a live cluster the same way you would run in production and to debug your container right then and there.
Yep, that's exactly it.
That's really cool. How does that impact developer life cycles in companies? Do you think that's going to speed things up or?
Yeah, for the customer we've talked to, there's been a lot of support and excitement around it, and huge community support. We recently open sourced it, so we're actually accepting pull requests and feature requests for folks. So Bridge Kubernetes on GitHub, please take a look. But yeah, that's exactly it. If you think about the kind of historical meme around developers saying, "Oh, it works on my machine,"
Right.
like this gets rid of that. The idea is you actually run it in the cluster. You can send real traffic to it. It can interact with all the other things running in the cluster, and then you can actually see how your changes are impacting functionality and features real time, which I think makes a huge difference.
For sure. So, and a lot of the times when I've fiddled with Kubernetes, it's about spinning up my local cluster on my local machine. I have to know how to do all of that.
Sure.
It sounds like this circumvents that, right?
Exactly.
You run the Azure service. It places an ephemeral cluster in Azure Kubernetes service, and I'm assuming you're paying for that, right? Like
very reasonable prices.
I was going to say reasonable prices, but you're going to pay for that. But that's good because then, as we mentioned, you're going to be able to run everything in that cluster as if it were behind a real load balancer with a real certificate, right? Hopefully not like a self-signed cert or anything like that, but a real certificate that you can truly make sure that your application runs. That's really cool. Yeah, I actually haven't seen that on any other clustering platform that I know of at this point.
So would this be kind of similar to coming from the app services world? I know app services has the remote debugging feature in Visual Studio where you can just attach your local debugger directly to a running instance of your app that's running in Azure. Would that be kind of a corollary here?
Yeah, it's similar. The big difference is just like you can actually make changes in your IDE and see them reflected because the traffic is coming back to your machine. But very similar to kind of providing that remote debugging.
And are you literally hot reloading those DLLs or the Java binaries or whatever inside the container?
We are redeploying a container.
You're redeploying. Okay,
Yeah.
I misunderstood you. That's really cool, though. By the
It
way,
feels like hot reload.
it does feel like you're doing that, right?
Yeah.
Because I remember, like, I did a lot of Microsoft, development in my career, and my favorite thing about working in C# is just live reloading that DLL.
Sure.
Like you make a change, it automatically redeploys it. Your changes are there. That's really cool, as opposed to a Java where you got to run a Gradle, whatever. Again, not hating on Java, it's fine. Maybe they have newer sort of hot reloading capabilities in the new JVMs, but back in the day when I was doing Microsoft, that was one of my favorite things. Is I could very quickly see changes, almost to the point of like it's an interpreted language, like a Python. Right, where it's instantaneously you see those modifications and you can debug almost immediately. Tom, thank you, man. This has been awesome. We appreciate your time. Thanks to Microsoft for all the amazing things that y'all are doing over in Azure Kubernetes service. Excuse me. If you want to find out more, Tom, are there any other links that you want to send folks?
Yeah, I think obviously come to Azure anywhere you like, but Kube Copilot on GitHub, as well as Bridge Kubernetes and Draft, all on GitHub. Definitely open to community, both feature suggestions as well as pull requests. So love to see you out there.
Awesome. We'll go ahead and drop those links in the description below. And again, if you enjoyed this conversation, let us know. We'll have more. Always love to highlight really cool things that people are doing out in the engineering community. So thank you, Tom. Thank you, Alan, for joining us. And y'all have a good day.
Thanks for having me. See ya.